Welcome back to Harbour Unboxed. There were too many questions. So part 3, which we've been doing for a while now anyway, so maybe there was just enough.
There was the normal amount of questions, and we hedged our bets whether there would be 2 or 3 parts, and there was 3 parts, so there we go.
So I guess, why am I surprised?
Yeah,
Who knows?
It happens every month, doesn't
Yep.
it, basically?
Yep. All right, do the thing. Today's sponsor spot is brought to you by PowerColor and their Red Devil RX 7900 series of graphics cards. Designed for 4K gaming, the Red Devil series ensures optimal performance with low temperatures and whisper quiet operation. And although cool and quiet gaming is the priority, PowerColor aren't afraid to do it in style, allowing gamers to customize the look of their Red Devil 7900 series graphics card with Devil skins. Their uniquely designed backplates. Devil skins are extremely easy to attach with pre-installed magnets, and currently gamers can choose from the generative skin for a hellish appearance or the intrusive skin for those of you who are after something a bit more subtle. So for more information, please check the link in the video description. Alright, question here from Lionel. Lionel's actually a long-time Discord member and he recently challenged me to a 1v1 in CSGO. So he plays Call of Duty, I play Fortnite. We basically found out that neither of us like CSGO anymore. We both played it a long time ago. So anyway, bit of backstory there about Lionel. We'll get into whatever his question is. Where do you see the future of computer hardware testing heading? Okay. Are there any new technologies emerging that would make your testing any better or easier? Well, there's not really been anything that makes it easier, I would have said, over the last little bit. I could be forgetting some obvious stuff, but yeah, it's gotten a lot more tedious and a lot more annoying, I would say. I'm starting to enjoy it less and less, just because, like, some games are worse than others, of course, but there's games where, we got to a point where, resolution scalers in games. It's like, okay, that's a nice feature to have. It's not particularly nice when you load up a game and it goes to 120%, or you load it up and it goes to 50%. And depending on what graphics card you put in there, it just decides, oh, I've detected an RTX 3070 and we're using a bit too much VRAM, so we'll slam that thing down to 50%. And it's in a different sub-menu. It's in like advanced display settings that you never, ever visit. So now you've got to make a note, okay, in that game, like Far Cry or whatever, make sure you go and check that the scale is set to 100%. So that's just, another tedious, annoying thing. And then you get upscalers added left, right, and center. And then you test a game like Cyberpunk. I'm ranting, aren't I? But I'll continue. You test a game like Cyberpunk 2077 for a long time. Then they add a patch that when you enable the ultra quality preset, it just enables FSR by default. And it's like, hang on, why are my results not lining up with my previous results? And then once you go and manually disable that, then it says using a custom preset, you get the results you were getting. So that's also annoying. Then, don't even get me started about DLSS and FSR and all that. And DLSS 3 or FSR 3, this frame generation stuff, that's more of a nightmare, I suppose, on the viewer's end.
Yeah, I think there'll be
people requesting that, why aren't you testing the 4070 Ti with frame generation? You're such an AMD shill. I can't believe you wouldn't test with the best feature ever, DLSS 3. And it's just like, oh no, what's happened?
Yeah, I think it's the marketing BS is ramping up harder than ever with these features, and it seems like a lot of people are kind of getting a little bit sucked into some of these things. I think it's definitely important to, like, comparing now to 5-10 years ago, you have to be testing visual quality of games. It's very important to see where things like DLSS versus FSR lie, because many people are using them, but companies are trying as hard as they possibly can, Nvidia mostly, to muddy the waters as much as possible by there's the performance side of things, which is one side of testing, the visual side of things.
I'd just like to say that Tim's opinions are his own and don't necessarily represent Harbour. So go on.
Sure you don't have these opinions. So I think the way that these things should be tested and the way that makes the most sense, you always try and isolate variables and create apples to apples comparisons. That's always what you've done. So you test performance on one thing, you keep visual quality the same, you look at that, and then you look at visual quality, you change the settings, you can mess around with performance, but you're trying to look at the visual side of things, the actual end result. And that's the way that people should be testing, but companies are really trying very hard to put those two things together and really mix them up so that we're testing performance and visual quality settings that are different all around. NVIDIA's making big talk about how
This used to
DLSS 3
be-
improves performance, but when they say performance, they mean visual smoothness. They don't mean latency. So that just complicates things. So it's become harder to sort of...
Yeah, this used to be considered cheating benchmarks once upon a time. Any
Yes.
slight change in visuals, like not rendering something quite correctly, that was cheating.
Yeah,
Now it's just
definitely-
a feature.
definitely.
Now it's a key selling point. Being a bit extreme to one degree, like we do believe technologies like DLSS are very impressive and are beneficial.
Whereas turning down a setting just to cheat a benchmark is not really beneficial to anyone.
No, that's right. So
But that's where it gets really hard, because previously we would just say that's cheating. We'll correct that. We'll bump up the whatever setting was turned down. We'll correct it. We'll level the playing field. But these days it's more, we have to consider that feature because it is something that you would use. And things like DLSS 3, I think there's a lot of...
or frame generation, I think.
Frame generation. There's a lot of muddying of the waters of what does performance mean now?
What's a frame?
What's a frame? Like that's a discussion we wouldn't have had 5 years ago. We wouldn't have to look at FPS numbers and say, well, that's half the benefit you were getting previously. And it becomes very difficult because NVIDIA goes and says, hey, we've doubled performance. And it's like, well, they're not lying because the FPS is doubled. But then what FPS means is changed. So how do you approach that? And not only does it make our lives more difficult, it just opens us wide open to criticism. Because previously, when you're just talking about FPS benchmarks and you test everything the same, everyone gets it. Everyone understands the playing field that we're talking about. But now it's like, oh well, I can justify not apples to apples testing, so I'm going to criticize you for not doing that because I think that it shouldn't be apples to apples. And my reasoning is that NVIDIA should use DLSS, AMD should use FSR, whatever the case is. It becomes, it's made our lives more difficult.
Yeah, for those not quite up to speed on, it's like a frame used to include an input to the frame to direct wherever your character was looking or whatever you were doing. So there was an input component there. Whereas with DLSS, I don't know, what's the generated frame, let's put it that way, and I won't use any other language to describe it, but the generated frame has no input. So it's just a guesstimate between the frames. So it does smooth the image, but it's not adding any input there. And I guess I'm not saying that it's invalid or it's not a useful technology. It can definitely improve the gaming experience. It's completely useless for multiplayer gaming. Multiplayer gaming, you would absolutely never use it. No exception there. But for single player gaming, it can, at least my belief is, in a sort of narrow frame rate window, improve the visual representation of the game while not to a noticeable degree making the input feel weird. 30 FPS native to 60 FPS frame generation is horrible in my opinion. But there are some people that don't. They would rather the image not be like stuttery and be smooth, but still have the input feeling like you're drunk. So
and that's where the difficulty comes in, because we've got one thing producing 120 FPS, one thing producing 120 FPS. Companies are trying to compare those like they're the same, and then we get to it and it's like, well, they're not really the same, but then maybe you'd use it or not use it. So again, it becomes very difficult, but I'm hoping that over time, end users and people watching these reviews and stuff will sort of understand what we're talking about over time as you get more and more examples of using these things. What is 120 FPS with all frames natively generated versus 120 FPS with half the frames being generated? What does that feel like to use? What does it look like?
It'll feel very different.
Hopefully over time, people will sort of get used to these sorts of approaches. And it took time with things like DLSS, because early days, people were sort of looking at it. We looked at it very critically, but there were a lot of people with DLSS 1 that turned it on and were like, my FPS is way higher now, and that's all that matters to me. But then over time, people realize actually the visual quality of this isn't very impressive. We need DLSS 2 that comes out. We know how that story's played out. So like I said, it makes our life difficult, and we're a very privileged position that people watch a lot of our content and do criticize it and actually pay attention to what we're saying and look at it and make arguments for and against what we're doing. But 5 years ago, we were just making FPS benchmarks and calling it a day, and you look at it, it's like very simple. Unfortunately, though, there's no real like new test tools or stuff that makes this any easier. Like, imagine if there was a tool where we could click a button and it equalizes the visuals using all the the settings and stuff, so we get the same visuals. That sort of thing doesn't exist. So
now, if anything, games have just gotten worse. In that
so
regard.
it's very much we have to test visuals, we have to test performance, we have to make subjective analysis, which is always less strong than objective analysis. So yeah, hopefully it comes across that we're trying our best there. But yeah, what can you do? Would you consider testing mid-tier GPUs on older and newer CPUs? The community will scream bottleneck on like a 5800X and 3070 or a 6700 XT and say you need an X3D or 13900K. Some guides on building optimal systems or bounce systems maybe not just the best of the best. I think this comes up a lot.
So this is sort of, I think this is a CPU, GPU scaling type question, which we've done a fair bit of that content in the past, and I'm sure we will do more of it in the future. It does take a lot of time, really. There's an enormous amount of testing there to do it, and it doesn't answer the question definitively. Like, for example, pick any random game. Obviously, there's resolution scaling that goes with the CPU and GPU scaling, and there's quality preset scaling. I've actually done scaling content in the past that scaled everything. It scaled the CPUs and GPUs, it scaled the resolution and the quality presets. You end up with about 9 graphs for one game. So it is interesting, but how much more useful it is than just the normal benchmarking is hard to say. It's a different way of looking at it, but I don't think it's necessarily better or more useful, as I said. But yeah, there'll be more CPU and GPU scaling in the future, but yeah, I'm not sure what else to say about that. We have done it. Maybe I'll find a link to one and I'll link it in the comment section for you to look at. But because no one plays games the same way, it's difficult to dial in settings that make sense for everyone. So this is just a tough one to cover, really. All right, what's your favorite things to do outside of hub/hobbies? I reckon this question is actually asking like, what are our favorite hobbies? Because outside of hub, Unboxed and hobbies,
I love what? Eating food.
I mean, I do like eating food.
I don't know.
So let's just, for the sake of making this semi-interesting, we'll go with, what do we like doing outside of our job? Which our job, I suppose maybe the question was sort of /hobby, because our job is kind of our hobby that we've made a job. So outside of playing with computer hardware, probably playing computer games, all things computer related that could be squeezed into sort of the hub job. Do you want me to go first or you?
Yeah, no, you go first. You got more things than me anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I like doing plenty of other things. It's the problem is finding the time to do it, obviously. So I recently just went on a kayak fishing trip with some of the boys for a week, and that was amazingly good fun. So I've got a couple of big Hobie sailing kayaks, and we sailed around the ocean and caught tuna and mackerel and all kinds of stuff, and that was a blast. So obviously fishing, kayaking, that's a hobby I enjoy that I very rarely get to do. I've got a lot of cool gear to do it, but unfortunately I don't get to use it that often. I love anything really construction related, handyman type stuff. I mean, you guys have probably seen I built this entire studio basically, and all the stuff in it. I did a shed project, which you can see in our BTS content if you signed up for our BTS stuff. I did a lot of framing and stuff. nearly killed myself over at Tim's place, but that's come out really well.
Yep.
Quite an intricate framing that we did over there. So yeah, and then I enjoy sports and all kinds of stuff like that as well, but I could probably go on, so I'll let Tim talk about a thing.
Yeah, the one thing. I mean, yeah, I think, I wouldn't say there's a heap of crossover between our hobbies. I started getting more into the construction side of things now that I own a house.
He's a bit of a Tim the Tool man.
Very much if you're renting like I was previously, it's not really a viable hobby. Whereas these days, sort of home maintenance and gardening and stuff's become more of an interest. But, I think people have seen, at least in the background of my set, my big Lego collection. That's something I very much like doing. I find it kind of like just an escape from doing the tech side of things, because it's very different. You're sort of just sitting down, you switched off, it can almost become like just a relaxing robotic sort of thing, which I quite enjoy. It's just sort of a hands-on task, just sort of, just refresh a bit, and you get a nice sort of cool thing you can put on a shelf at the end. So that's where my love of Lego comes from. Obviously, did as a kid as well, so that always helps. But yeah, my big Lego collection. And then on top of that, I would say I'm much more of a diehard sports fan than Steve is. So yeah, that's why I get a lot of social interactions. Like Steve, you play a lot of multiplayer games with mates. For me, my mates aren't so much gamers, but I know a lot of people who are very into sports like AFL, so Australian rules football here in Australia, cricket, those sorts of things. Love chatting about that. Love getting really into players and trade seasons and drafting teams and stuff. So yeah, it's just, it is sitting down watching things. So I don't play sport because my body just would collapse instantly from playing any sort of sport. But watching it and being passionate about those sorts of things I enjoy. And yeah, like my dad's really into footy and stuff like that as well. So yeah, it's just good to get out and talk about different things. And because often when I'm chatting with you, it's always about tech, and with you guys as well on the channel, it's always about tech and stuff. But just having that sort of another thing to chat about that sort of, I don't have to talk about my job and what's going on and what games I'm playing, what hardware I'm testing, but I can talk about which player played terribly on the weekend.
Basically,
like
Tim abuses his TV on the weekend by just shouting at players.
Yeah, well, I don't follow a very good team at the moment, so it's been a few years of pain there. But
and I abuse my friends playing multiplayer games.
Yeah.
Yours is probably healthier than mine. Explains why I'm running short on friends.
But yeah, so those are the things we do outside. But again, like you said, it's very difficult to find the sort of time to balance all these things. So usually I try and not work too much on the weekend so I can have some time to, watch sports and things like that and do a few other things. But yeah, when you sort of, YouTube does become part of your life, really. It's not so much set hours and things.
Yeah, I work 7 days a week.
Yeah.
So
it's hard to switch off, but I try. What do I have to say to convince you that all CPU reviews should include 1440p and 4K testing on max settings paired with the top-of-the-line GPU? I'm not saying to do this with every game, up to 4 games in each of the higher resolutions, just for a sanity check for the average consumer.
Well, there's nothing you can really say.
You are unconvincible, isn't it?
Yeah, I don't really know how to say much here without sounding arrogant, but we sort of know what we're doing with this stuff, and while you might think it's a sanity check, it's not. While you might think it's useful information, it's not. And you're kind of doing what we would be accused of doing, which is thinking we know best for gamers by giving like a criteria that has to be tested. And I know you're sort of saying just do a couple of games, which I also don't know how that's particularly useful because it would really it'd only cover a couple of games and be relevant for a couple of games. I can't go about this subject and explain it any clearer than I did in my video that covered this in depth and explained it from every possible angle. Because Watch Dogs Legion, okay, let's pick that game. What quality setting? So ultra settings with a 4090. Who's that relevant for? Like people with a 4090? And then how is that a sanity check? Are you like, see, I told you I could play Watch Dogs Legion on my 4090 with a Core i3. I didn't need the Core i9. Like, it just becomes a bit silly. As I explained in the video, it's a CPU review, therefore we're isolating the component we're testing and looking at that. And you can say, again, it's not that realistic. I want to know what it does at 4K. But you just have to... It's not about resolution. It's about the frame rate that you deem acceptable when you're spending money on whatever CPU you have and whatever GPU you have. So if you're like me and you go, I don't like the input when it's below 90 FPS, therefore I'm a 90 FPS minimum gamer, I want 90 FPS. Does the CPU enable 90 FPS at 1080p? Yeah, it does. Well, then it'll enable it at 4K, and at 4K, you will be using the quality settings that enables your desired frame rate. It's that simple, right?
And I think with these sort of like, obviously the goal with why people want the 4K ultra settings.
Oh, look, it does 30 FPS.
Yeah, and they want to show like the GPU limited scenarios so that their choice of not spending money is sort of justified and all that. But I think it does gamers almost a disservice by showing that data. It's one of the rare circumstances where I think showing that data is actually worse than not showing it to some degree, because people they want to sort of, what's the best way of putting it? It's like you want to have your opinion validated that the CPU doesn't matter. So you can spend the least amount of money and you save money there. You can put all in the GPU because you go, I'm always going to be GPU limited. Let's just look at the GPU limited results. It's confirmed that I'm GPU limited. There's no difference, which you probably should already know if you're GPU limited. But then it's kind of, first of all, it ignores all that CPU differences. So if you do run into a game where it's CPU limited, if you're just looking at the GPU limited results, you've looked at the wrong data for your CPU limited comparison where it actually matters. And that may be with a future GPU or future games. You may not be running into that now, but somewhere down the line, you may, even today, like you could have bought a low-end CPU for your 4090 and got away with playing your Cyberpunks and stuff at reasonable high quality settings and not run into something. Then you hit a Hogwarts Legacy type title where you're running it at 4K Ultra with ray tracing, and there are areas that are highly CPU demanding. Mm-hmm. And you might have made the wrong choice because the only thing you looked at was the GPU, the GPU limited data. And yes, the CPU limited data was still in the review for people to look at, but often people can have a bit of tunnel vision with those things where, they've got in their minds what they're looking for, the GPU limited stuff. They ignore the things that are more relevant and they're just looking at that one thing. And so often with our reviews, we do put a lot of time and effort into thinking about the things that should and shouldn't be shown to people, the things that are the most relevant to make it as simple as possible to understand where the performance differences lie. And there are times where showing things that aren't relevant is actually makes it harder for people to understand what's going on.
For sure. And it's, as I said, with Watch Dogs Legion Ultra at 4K, if it does like 50 FPS but my minimum is 90, it's worthless data because I won't play it Ultra at 4K because I find that awful. I hate the input. I won't play that way. So I'll reduce the visuals to get the GPU or enable DLSS or whatever it may be to get that level of performance. So, yeah, I don't know what other way we can put this that you're avoiding, as Tim says, you're avoiding being given useful information. So it's not about which CPU is the fastest. It's about looking at these graphs at 1080p and going, oh, okay, so we've just looked at a dozen games. I've looked at them and studied them all individually. I've got my 12-game average here. The 13900K, it's not really much faster than the 13700K. It's quite a bit more expensive, a lot more power there. The 13700K looks like a really good sweet spot high-end CPU. I think I'll buy that. That's what you're meant to take away from the reviews, not which one's the fastest or, but if I play at 4K, and again, you can look at the 12-game average and you can see what the average frame rate was for the 13700K. And if the 13600K is very close to the Core i5 processor, and you're like, well, look, the 13600K enables 90 FPS at 1080p with a high-end GPU across all these games. I'm happy gaming at 30 FPS at 4K. I like that experience. I'm happy with that. Well, then you don't need a high-end CPU. So you can work all this stuff out with that information, whereas with the GPU limited stuff, as Tim's saying, all of that's masked. You have no idea what's going on.
But I think it comes down to people wanting reviews to be showing you the exact number that you'll get.
Yeah, which they don't do anyway. It just doesn't do that anyway because you'll use different quality settings, different hardware configurations, different memory. You won't be running necessarily, in the case of like the 13900K, you might not be using DDR5 7200 memory because it's not sweet spot memory. It costs $100 more for like 2% more performance. There's a whole heap of factors there to consider. And really we are looking at the optimal out-of-the-box configuration for each part, how much difference is there. And you really, like when we look for sweet spot memory, you're looking for that sweet spot CPU. And it's usually not the 13900K. That's just, I want the fastest of the fastest. And again, as Tim said, there's so many other factors as well, like how much more CPU demanding will games be in 1 year from now. So although the 13600K and the 13700K are that close in basically all of the games now, will that margin open up? And again, we don't necessarily say to buy parts based on that, but if you can see that there's a reasonable difference now when CPU limited, chances are that'll end up being a better value buy for future more demanding games. Anyway, we can talk about this forever and a day. Yes, I would love to include 1080p, 1440p, and 4K data in every review, but it's a stupid amount of work that ultimately is a waste of time for the most part. And it also makes the reviews much more difficult for the average viewer to digest, as Tim sort of pointed out. So rather than confuse them with a whole heap of information that isn't terribly useful, despite the fact that some people think it is, it's not though. But again, that's just me being arrogant or whatever and thinking I know best, I guess, as a reviewer of more than 2 decades. Anyway, move on to the next one. Hub is the only / one of the very few channels that show memory scaling benchmarks. A tech review is too focused on CPUs and GPUs and overlooking memory. Well, I'll have to take your word for it on that one. Not sure. From our perspective, that content's not very popular, generally speaking. Some of it does okay. Our recent 13900K, so 13th gen Raptor Lake memory, tuning and overclocking, which we put a huge amount of time in to that one and worked with Buildzoid, that bombed really hard. I think the video is maybe on 50,000 views, which is half what we'd expect from that sort of content. People just did not care about Intel memory performance or scaling at all. Even the Zen 4 one didn't do particularly well. I think it's dragged itself up to a sort of the minimum target we expect to get on a video. But yeah, it's just not popular content and it takes a lot of time and effort. And I guess that's sort of it.
Yeah, and the scenario where memory tuning makes sense for gamers is limited.
Most people just don't care because of that, yeah.
Yeah, like most people just find running XMP, getting a reasonable kit of memory and calling it a day, especially because like most people are trying to be GPU limited when they're gaming, whereas these things tend to only impact CPU limited gaming. So it becomes, yeah, I think the focus that people have on CPU and GPU performance, those two things are still the primary things people are interested in and the things that have the most impact on performance.
Yeah, it's kind of become a thing now where for guys like Buildzoid that are chasing maximum overclocks or high scores in sort of synthetic tests, that's a fun thing in itself. But for actual gaming, it's all a bit silly. It's for guys that like to argue on forums about which one's faster, the 1300K or the 7950X 3D, and normal gamers who just want to game don't care if one is 1% faster. Like, you know, the 3D Vcache CPU might be 4 or 5% faster stock. It's like, yay, hardly worth calling a win. But then if you buy a specific motherboard for the 1300K and manage to get a good quality silicon with a high quality IMC, and you can run DDR5 8000 or whatever actually stable, which is a dubious claim at best, it would seem, it's 1% or 2% faster than the 7950X 3D. Who cares? Like, 99.9% of you guys watching this do not care about that. It's a whole heap of messing around to wrist stability for very little gains. So I guess that's why that content doesn't perform well, because you guys largely don't care. If it was a situation where a bit of memory tuning that was well and truly stable and achievable on all motherboards resulted in a 15-20% performance uplift, that's pretty noteworthy and worth investigating. But when you're talking about wringing its neck for single-digit gains and definitely looking at compromising stability doing that, then the interest in it wanes. And
I think where it matters is you don't want to be spending too much on a memory kit that has no benefit, and you also don't want to spend money on a kit where you could be getting a better kit for the same price. So you want to know sort of
the sweet spot.
The sweet spot. I think that's important, but beyond that, as you say, like the high performance stuff isn't.
And the sweet
relevant.
spot generally doesn't change over time. Like, as we get more demanding games and games become more memory bandwidth sensitive, you will see a higher tier of memory becoming, the sweet spot. So it will shift a little bit in some instances, not always. But there's no point spending way more on that money now so that you'll have that money. So you'll have that memory once it becomes sweet spot in like 2 years' time.
Yeah.
You're always better off buying the sweet spot memory that's available at the time of testing.
Yeah.
That's what made it the sweet spot memory.
Can you give us your thoughts on the current state of the 30 series GPUs and their VRAM limitations, specifically from the 3060 Ti to 3070 Ti? It seems like it's already started to become an issue with the newly released RE4 remake, so Resident Evil 4. As someone with an RTX 3070 laptop GPU, should this be a concern to me? I imagine the VRAM limitation will only get worse in the future. Which also begs the question why NVIDIA cuts corners like this on high-end products. They can't pretend they didn't know VRAM would be an issue in the future. It's an issue.
Well, I mean, it's an issue, but it was known at the time. It's not like they scammed you or whatever. It's
Well, some people didn't want to believe it was an issue at the time.
Well, that's true. So I guess as an example of that, I reviewed, obviously, the RX 6800, so the Radeon RX 6800, which has 16 gigabytes of VRAM. And I also reviewed the GeForce RTX 3070, which has 8 gigabytes of VRAM, 3070 Ti and the 3060 Ti, which is probably more forgivable as it's a lower end part, but whatever. I did a big head-to-head benchmark between the RTX 3070 and the RX 6800. Noted that performance overall was quite similar. Yeah, better ray tracing on the 3070, though I questioned how useful that would be in the future. I was criticized heavily for that, apparently, or evidently. And the main difference that I said would sway me towards buying the RX 6800 was the fact that it had twice as much VRAM, and I didn't take that lightly. I noted at the time that, yeah, look, 8 gigabytes of VRAM is perfectly fine. You'll get by in pretty much all situations. But a couple of years down the track, I think if you're buying this car and you're planning on keeping it for 3-4 years, you'll find the RX 6800 will actually enable a better gaming experience. While I haven't revisited those yet, I plan to very soon. It does seem like the 16 gigabytes of VRAM has aged significantly better than 8. Hogwarts Legacy is terrible on the RTX 3070. Like, the high quality preset, which is the second highest quality preset, so not the ultra maxed out preset, with the second highest level of ray tracing, I think at 1080p, you're looking at over 60 FPS on an RTX 3070. Like, it has that throughput, that raw compute performance, but you run out of VRAM, even on the second highest quality presets for both ray tracing and just the general visual quality settings. And it'll crash to desktop, it'll run poorly. Even with the latest, most patched up version of Hogwarts Legacy, 8 gigabytes of VRAM is still a problem with ray tracing enabled, even with dialed down quality settings. Whereas with 16 gigabytes of VRAM, no problem. So removing don't make this an AMD versus NVIDIA thing. Let's forget about Radeon and not make it like this silly fanboy argument type thing. Let's pretend like Radeon GPUs don't even exist, because they're not really relevant to this actual conversation. I know I talked about the head-to-head video, but it was more my opinion that more VRAM would be beneficial before too long. And here we are. And had that card had 16 gigabytes of VRAM, it would be able to play the game. So,
yeah.
that's I can't. That's a big deal, right? Like, it's not a situation where we're dialing up the quality settings to the point where the fact that it's running out of VRAM isn't the primary concern. It's the fact that you're getting 20 frames per second or 30 frames or even 40. But this is a card that can do comfortably over 60 FPS had it had enough VRAM. But the second you walk to a new area and you fill up that VRAM buffer, it just turns into Starter City. I showed Tim just before, as luck would have it, I was doing a little bit of testing. And even on the medium quality settings, so medium quality preset settings, but with ray tracing enabled, you just had texture popping constantly. Like, you could stand on the spot and you go compressed textures that look awful to the actual proper textures, and it just kept swapping in and out of memory. It was this weird thing in Hogwarts Legacy, but it's not the only game. There's plenty of games that have these problems.
I think with these discussions, it comes down to, and we were talking to you about this earlier as well, there's a few factors that go into this. I think one of them is that at the time that these products were launched with not enough VRAM, it was...
For the future.
It was criticized when you bring that up as sort of an issue with the product, it was easily dismissed by people. Not only were you criticized, but people were like, that's not a problem.
And I'm not trying to say AMD was better or buy AMD because of this reason. I'm just saying, here is what I believe to be a problem before too long with this product.
Yeah, and I think, with these VRAM things, it's always something that doesn't appear on day one, which makes it very difficult for people to sort of grasp what impact it's going to have. Because when you look at the day one reviews and you see all the performance data and it performs well, there's maybe one or two circumstances where VRAM is on the edge, but mostly it's going to be fine. You look at that, and then someone like you in the conclusion is saying, well, it's probably going to run out of VRAM in a few years. There's that disconnect there. People are sort of looking at the performance, it looks okay, and then someone saying in 2 or 3 years or down the line, it's not going to be great.
Like, I'm trying to unfairly water it down.
Yeah, so it feels like that is kind of a bit unfair because you're sort of bringing up a point that's not really relevant. It doesn't feel relevant because there's no games at the time that really have that issue. So people sort of dismiss it as an issue, and we cop a bit of criticism, which again,
a bit.
That's fine. People are free to criticize our videos, but I think it goes to sort of, I don't know whether it's like a lack of experience or it's just I get where people came from at the time. Like I said, you look at the performance, it looks fine. You're not really thinking about 2 or 3 years down the track, whereas us as reviewers, we've seen these things play out before with cards, the transition from say 4 to 8 gigabytes of VRAM for flagship models.
I saw it from 1 to 2.
1 to 2, you can go back as far as where gigabyte wasn't even considered in terms of the amount of VRAM.
I remember megabytes.
So
anyway, yeah, that's right.
Yeah, it's sort of, we know that it can often creep up quite quickly where there comes a point where games come out and the cards suddenly just don't run games very well. And I think for people that were sort of newer to GPUs, this might have been their first GPU or second GPU generation, there was a period of time for quite a while where 8 gigabytes was perfectly fine. Whereas we were sort of looking at it, we were sort of comparing it to what we'd seen in the past with things like the 2 to 4, 4 to 8 gig, where it sort of looked like it was getting a bit dicey, and we sort of used our experience and our historical knowledge to sort of say, well, this looks like it'll probably be a problem. And this was further evidenced by looking at game consoles which were just launching with 16 gigabytes of unified memory, which means that game developers, more likely than not, were going to be thinking about producing games using 16 gig of VRAM because they have access to that on what is a mid-range, mid-tier performing system. So, when we sort of judge up all these factors, we're weighing everything in, we're saying, what happened previously in the past, where are things playing out now? Are there any edge cases now? What are the consoles doing? We can come to the conclusion that VRAM is an issue. Whereas, again, for people who are sort of, they're just looking at things today and maybe this is the first PC that they're building. Again, I think it's understandable why people didn't see that as that significant of a problem. But unfortunately, what that means is that what's now playing out is that games indeed are using more VRAM. People bought those cards that maybe didn't weigh that factor significantly enough and are now, unfortunately, getting a bit burned with some of these games coming out like Resident Evil. I've heard Diablo 4 beta uses a lot of VRAM. Whether or not that has any performance impacts, I'm not sure. Hogwarts Legacy, more ray tracing games coming out where ray tracing increases VRAM usage. And I just find it very unfortunate. It's kind of sad to see someone who spent potentially during the cryptocurrency boom has spent over $1,000 on a product like a 3070 Ti or 3070 that now can't run their games on ultra settings with ray tracing simply for one reason, and that's because it wasn't a 16 gigabyte card or 20 gigabyte card. Yeah,
it's tough, especially if you had bought that over a 6800 XT or something like that because you were more interested in the ray tracing performance. And we were recommending a 3070 over a Radeon GPU if you cared about ray tracing. Now, admittedly, you could have enjoyed ray tracing in all the games that have come up to now. Yeah. But it was a limited time only deal, I suppose. And not that ray tracing performance has improved on RDNA 2, but it's more that if you can play stuff like Hogwarts Legacy at 1440p using the ultra quality settings, but with ray tracing disabled on an RX 6800, but that I know for a fact that is stuttery and a bit sketchy on the 3070 because you're looking at like needing about 9 gigs of VRAM, you are getting a better experience on that card with twice as much VRAM.
Yeah. And it's difficult with the reviews as well because you do have to toss up what's the performance like for the next 2 years versus 4 years. For some people, they may have strongly preferred that performance now, the better performing card for ray tracing.
Which is reasonable.
For those first 2 years, and they've downweighed the performance in 4 years' time, which is a perfect, like I said, it's such a difficult discussion because we don't want to sit here saying, everyone should have bought the 16 gig card because it was obvious this was going to happen and you're really dumb for not buying the 16 gig card.
It's not that situation.
There's so many different factors being weighed up into this. I just think it's
more the point that it was reasonable to acknowledge that being a potential weakness.
Yeah, it was reasonable, and it's just disappointing that NVIDIA didn't include more VRAM because a 3070 with 16 gigabytes of VRAM would have been a killer product. Well, it would still be great today.
Be awesome today.
Would have been a great buy. And again, for those people who spent like $1,500 on it during the pandemic, they'd still be using it today just fine.
That's right. If you buy a product like that you can enjoy for multiple years, you're satisfied with that product and you're certainly willing to go back to that brand and buy another product like GTX 1080 Ti owners. I don't think there's too many GTX 1080 Ti owners out there that bought that product for $700 US and are like, damn, I wish I hadn't have bought that. It was a bad value product or it didn't work out. Basically nobody. Everyone's happy with it. So example of a good product.
Yeah, and I think with these VRAM things on the upcoming cards potentially only having like 8 gigabytes of VRAM at $500 US, I find it interesting that a company like NVIDIA is very much tends to be on the forefront of technologies. They're first to ray tracing. They're first to DLSS like upscaling. They've been first to frame generation. And yet stuttering is a big issue in modern games, and that is something that can usually be improved by more memory allocation. You just load more things in, it stutters less. So it's interesting that we've got NVIDIA being always at the forefront of features, but then there's this obvious hardware feature that they're not at the forefront of. It's very much a disconnect between they want people to buy cards for getting ray tracing now, but then the VRAM thing is kind of left behind. It feels kind of weird there, doesn't it?
It does feel weird, but it all makes perfect sense because it's all about money, and features like DLSS, ray tracing have all been brought to the forefront to sell product. VRAM doesn't really sell product, and it clearly.
I think it will these days
Well,
as people learn more about it.
I think it'll become increasingly important, but I think for a long time it was just like 4 gigabytes or 8 gigabytes didn't really make a difference. That was the thing for so long, and that's why we didn't talk about it so much back then. And in fact, with like the RX 480, initially we were like, well, the 4 gigabyte model is better value, and that was true for many years. It wasn't until people were still buying them 4 years later that 8 gigabytes was necessary.
Although it's pretty crazy that card was $240 in 2016 with 8 gig of memory.
It is different type of memory, but still, still applies. But planned obsolescence, and cannibalizing professional grade products is probably the biggest one there. Because if they start offering gamers 20 gigabytes of VRAM, then that does cannibalize their professional products that they charge a lot more for.
Yeah, so, and it seems like AMD is willing to offer more VRAM, so that's potentially a point of competition for them this generation. Previously, they have had that advantage, but there's been, as you say, less of an immediate impact. So with like 6800 versus 3070, it's not a here and now, this is impacting your buying decision, whereas potentially if we had an 8 gigabyte NVIDIA GPU and a 12 gigabyte AMD GPU at the same sort of price, I think they'll have a much more significant impact for today. There'll be clear examples where the 12 gigabytes of VRAM would have a benefit. So
double would obviously be the...
Yeah, double would be...
Double's huge. That's where it's very significant.
But yeah, I think this VRAM sort of thing has kind of crept up, and in 2023 as we hit more towards games that are developed exclusively for the latest generation of consoles, we're going to see games where this has quite a significant impact. And, what I would like to see is certainly more testing and focus maybe on looking at, those games that do have those pervasive stutter issues that people are complaining about, where you're moving from one section to another, it's just stuttering like crazy. People always being like, oh, why isn't this fixed? Why aren't game developers able to address this? Is this something where the fix is as simple as using more VRAM, in which case buyers of those high VRAM cards would get a benefit in those games where it stutters? These are things that I think would be sort of interesting to look at, because it could be that sort of selling point advantage if that's a potential fix. Because you fix ray tracing by adding more ray tracing performance. Is stuttering fixed by more VRAM? Well,
it's more VRAM, and also in those instances more system memory, because obviously if you start to spill over a VRAM, that's where it ends up. You fill that up, and then loading other sections of the game becomes problematic.
And it's how the game works too. We can't just say throw 24 gig of VRAM at a game that fundamentally does load a game that way, but then again, my thinking is, is the game being designed that way to avoid performance issues on 8 gig cards? But if it was designed a bit differently to work well with 16 gig cards, would we have a more smooth experience for those high-end buyers? I think that's sort of I'm interested to see how that plays out, but obviously we're talking about hypotheticals now. But VRAM, it is an issue, and if we see a $500 card with 8 gig in 2023, that is not going to be good.
Not good at all, but I fear we're going to.
Yeah.
Alrighty. Thank you for watching, especially those of you that managed to watch parts 1, 2, and this third part. Big effort there. And if you made it all the way to the end, then you are in, probably for this, it'd be like the 10%, 5% club, if you did all three. So good job, you. Probably don't really need to tell you about Float Plane and Patreon, because if you're in the 5% club, you surely know about that stuff. You're probably already in there.
You've probably heard us say it in every single video of the last 400 videos.
Yes, so I'm not going to do it. I'm breaking the trend. We're not doing it.
Not doing it. What do you want to talk about instead? We've got a minute left in this video to talk about something else. How did the Melbourne Demons go on the weekend?
next question. I've got this. A lot of people will have been asking you, I reckon, in the comment section about the hub phone cover. And that's from Casetify. So we did an ad spot with them. So you might have seen that. So I guess I'm doing a free ad spot for them now. But yeah.
It's at the end of the video, so maybe 5% club.
Yeah, I'll bill them for this.
Yeah, sure.
But yeah, so we got a hub.
It looks pretty cool.
Hub phone case.
Yeah, it looks pretty cool.
So
I'm not a phone case kind of guy. I always keep my phone nice and breakable, so that as soon as I drop it, I need to buy a new phone.
Yeah, that would be me once a week. As soon as I go play with the power tools, I'll be welding.
I'm always like power tools. My phone's way over there.
Yeah, no. So, because I'll just go quickly do something. I'll go quickly fix that, and then I forget my phone's my pocket.
And what phone do you have? It's the
new S23
Not
Ultra.
sponsored by Samsung.
Yep. So. Not sponsored by Samsung. I got the blue one, the Hub Blue.
Hub Blue, hub case. You're hubified.
So anyway, I was just because I knew people would ask. So if people do ask, especially on this part 3, what's the deal with the phone case? Does that say hub? And they actually ask that without knowing. Oh no, they didn't want, and I'll mock them.
You'll mock them.
I'll mock them.
Oh.
So anyway,
people on socials will hate you even more now.
I'm gonna wreck them.
Yeah. Their opinion of you, low.
Thanks for watching. I'm your host, Steve.
I'm your host, Tim.
See you next time.